So hi everyone, thank you very much for coming. I am Bálint Misetics and I will be the facilitator of this workshop. I am a researcher and a practitioner of social policy as well as a founding member of A Város Mindenkié, or the City is for All, which is a housing rights activist group working here in Hungary. And our guest is Joanna Erbel, who is a sociologist and urban activist. Who in 2014 was also the Green Party candidate for the mayor of Warsaw. She's a member of the Polish Congress of Urban Movements. And more importantly, for our current discussion, she was responsible for the development of the government's housing program called Mieszkania Plus. Mieszkania Plus?
Not really like this, but I will like...
You will be explaining. Okay, sorry. I'm being inaccurate already. What is even more within our focus today is that she coordinated the development of housing policy strategy of Warsaw, and it is on this topic that she will present an introduction to us, if the technical difficulties will be solved by then.
Yeah, we'll manage with the technical difficulties. And to explain what you said while this is like starting, I was not working on the framework on the national program because it was done on the national level with a close group of experts. But at the moment I'm working for the company that is responsible for implementing the program. So we had the framework, we have the program, and what we are working now at the moment is the implementation. And if you give me like only like 2 minutes, because I wasn't ready to use my own computer, so I have a lot of mess on it.
Yes, so in the meantime, so first Joanna will present an introduction to the Housing 2030 program, which is the housing policy strategy for Warsaw until 2030. And then we will discuss two topics in particular in more detail. Two topics which were selected on the basis of what could be perhaps of most interest for an audience with mostly Hungarian participants. So the first of these topics is the private rental sector and about possible policy responses to the insecurity and informality of urban private rental sectors. And our second topic will be evictions, what the city of Warsaw could do against evictions, but also the more grassroots resistance against evictions which have been taking place in Warsaw for the past decade or so. And we will also discuss a particular legislation in Poland which might be problematic on the ground as far as the practice is concerned. However, looking from Hungary, it seems to be a very progressive and even exemplary piece of legislation which essentially grants an enforceable right to housing, an enforceable right to social housing to those who are being evicted or who are threatened with evictions, while at the same time also meeting some criteria in terms of income or disability and so on. And we are supposed to have around 20 minutes in the end for questions from you. But I would suggest, since there are not that many people here, that if you have a clarifying question, even as the discussion is working, you should just raise your hand and we will include your question. And in the end, you shouldn't rush away, if I may ask, because we would like to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the racist terrorist attacks that took place in Hungary. So we will dedicate a few minutes to this at the end of this session. So please stay. And
we have the presentation. So I'm ready. I'm not putting it there because the power will go out again. Okay. So I would like to tell you something about like housing policy in Warsaw. because first I was working on it, so I know it the best, and the second is a kind of representative to other housing policies in Poland, because it's more intense. Warsaw is probably the only city that is having like stable migration. We have more and more people coming. And but before I start, like a small framework. When in 2015 the government put forward a new program which was called, or new strategy which was called like a national urban policy, there was no chapter on housing in 2015. So like 3.5 years ago. Like our politicians didn't think that housing policy it's a part of the urban policy, and it should be regarded apart from the other things. In this like national urban policy, you can find a bit of housing, but only in the context of revitalization, gentrification. This book has like 200 pages, and on housing you have 2 or less. It was not a topic. We were living in the reality, then everyone was thinking that it's a market's role to create housing and to deliver housing. Government didn't think that it's their role, and the local municipalities were responsible only for the poorer ones. So for social housing, we didn't have anything that you have in other countries, in the Western countries, which is called like affordable housing, which means housing which is something between market and a really cheap social housing. And creating this affordable segment, this new segments, was my role and people who are working on the program, because we realize that like there's a huge gap in between, it's especially huge in Warsaw, when the price for the average price for communal housing is like 4 zloty, which means €1, and the average price on the market, the rental market, it's between 10 up to 15 zloty, which means 10 times more. And for many, many years, no one was asking a question, what with the people who are in between? The people who are working, they are having like regular jobs, they work in the city council, they work in a supermarket, in the post office, what with them? No one was thinking about them, because they are the people who cannot buy a flat on mortgage, and somehow they have to rent. Some of them, of course, they were former tenants of the communal housing, but not all of them, because many people were coming to Warsaw. And we had a really unjust like housing policy when it goes to the generation. So if your grandmother was born in Warsaw, or your grandparents moved to Warsaw just after the war, probably in your family you have a private flat or more that was former communal housing, communal flat, that your family bought out quite cheaply, like paying 10% on 30% of value. If your parents came to Warsaw and they were not earning much, they had the chance to be the communal tenants. But when you came to Warsaw and you didn't have the family in Warsaw or anything like this, the only thing you could do it was take a mortgage. That's what most of the housing and were connected, the private housing were on mortgages up to like 30 years, which is quite a lot. We have a kind of a speculation bubble, and because they were all, not all, but many of the people were taking the mortgages in Swiss francs, and out of sudden the Swiss franc doubled. We had like the year 2015 that it doubled. And they were in a huge problem. And out of sudden, like our government and local municipalities thought like, fuck, we have a problem. We have to think about something else. And this was the framework for developing this program. Like in Warsaw, we have altogether more than 900,000 housing units, all units. And we have more than 15,000 new housing units each year. Most of this is in the private market, which is quite interesting, because if you do take a data when it goes to the population, something would go wrong, because we have registered less than 2 million people, and they are selling, the developers are selling more flats than we have people, which means that we have many people who are not registered and many flats bought for speculation reasons. And it's quite difficult to put this number to get the real need. When you will see how many, what is the average, yearly average from the last 5 years in all these big cities, you'll see that Warsaw is developing quite fast. We still have the money, people are taking mortgages. We like to compare ourselves to Vienna because it's the city which has like similar structure. We have the similar number of the housing units, but what is the difference is the proportion between city-owned cooperatives. Like, you know, our cooperatives are all these old cooperatives which are something like private ownership, different type of the private ownership. But if you see the numbers, like the city-owned flats is only 9%. And when we are developing this new program and telling that we'll build new 15,000 flats, it meant that we'll still have 9% because the market is growing so fast. So currently we have about 85,000 units, where most of them are communal houses, and 2,000, a bit of more, 2,000, it's something which is called the Warsaw Community Housing Association. This TBS, it's a non-profit municipal developer where the rent is around like 20 zloty, which means like 5 euros. So it's like, this is the segment which is somewhere in between, but we have only less than 2,500 of these flats. What was the biggest problem in Warsaw is that we have an immense decrease of number of council housing units over the years. It was the reason for it was the political framework, the paradigm, and as well the recommendation of World Bank after transformation, when the World Bank recommended that people will take care of their flats if there will be owners. So they were selling cheaply, all cities were selling cheaply all the communal houses. Where most of them then came back to the market, because if you were inheriting a former communal house, usually you have to share the money, so you were selling it, and out of sudden it wasn't used to help people who were in the need, but they were simply like part of your like private budget, your family budget. And last 2 years we had another topic which was called like a restitution. So the representatives of former owners or former owners wanted to get back their flats that were taken from them by Bierut's law, is the law which was put forward to rebuild Warsaw, that everything was communalized, and then if your building was still there, you can take it back. Sometimes there was a street there, so you couldn't take it back. And we had a huge business, which was part of it was illegal, half illegal. So we lost almost 6,000 houses due to the restitutions, but most of them, they were simply sold cheaply. So when you have this narration that this restitution is responsible for diminishing Warsaw housing, it's not really true. What was true, it was like the logic of privatization. If you see how many houses we have in different districts, you can easily say, even you don't know the city quite well, which district it's a new one. The new ones are the districts with small numbers, and old ones are the districts with big numbers. Which is quite interesting because it means that in the city center you still have a lot communal housing, so you have a huge social mix. So you have flats that are sold for millions of zlotys, and just next to the flat you have an old lady or a family who is paying like less than €1 per square meter, which is quite a huge potential because we don't have like this in the city center, the districts that are extremely expensive. Over the years, cities started investing in the building communal housing, and they were reducing waiting list. At the moment, we have like about 3,000 households waiting in a list, and each year they were helping more and more families, which means that like in the few years, if this tendency is still the same, they will help most people who are on the waiting list for the communal housing, which means the people who are really in need because they don't work or they are like handicapped or there's somehow they are a big household. So it's not the communal tenants that is the biggest challenge at the moment, but like this empty average. Like over the years, we had like huge renovation program, and mostly we're renovating old buildings and building as well something new. The idea was to answer housing needs on a regular basis. So like using small amounts of flats in each district to get people from the waiting list. We had in these plans for the next years that are now in this program that is that are implemented now. It's like 500 new council housing needs, new housing in TBS. In the program, which is now in the consultation process, we altogether want to have like between 15 and 17,000 new houses up to 2030. The huge idea, what was a big change, and this is the big change that was eliminating this like substandard solutions. We had places like here that we have the Center for Single Mothers. In one of this would be a Łęka, which was a total disaster. And keeping it was only possible that for many, many years we have distinction between communal housing and social communal flat and social flat. The social flat was the one which were for the poorest people, and there was like the common sense that can be in a lower standard. And what has changed recently, that we have new law that is saying that you cannot have communal flat and social flat. All flats are communal. What is the difference? The difference only is in the rent. So you have the social rent on a communal flat. So, which means that the standard has to be the same. And although this is quite a new law, like in Poland it's often like this, that real changes, they are first than the legislation framework. So they were getting rid of this like substandard housing. They were taking people from places like here and giving them like normal flats in the city center. We had something which was probably the worst housing idea in the history of Warsaw. In 1995, there was an idea to build 3 social blocks in the middle of nowhere. It's hard to get to the city center, it's hard to get anywhere, it's like between railway tracks, and the closest thing is like jail. So it was quite terrible, and the idea was to put there like the social tenants, so the people who were not paying and were evicted, and sometimes people who simply had problems, and to create a social mix with police families. It was quite interesting idea. I don't know who got it, but you can imagine that the police families move out first. This black squares on building, it's another bad idea. It was the project of art in public spaces, part street art, and on one side you have like Mondrian, and on the other side Malevich with his black square. And somehow the local community wasn't very happy to have this part of like contemporary or art on their blogs. The artists didn't know why they are not unhappy, and they even felt that they are doing their harm, showing that they are like in such a bad situation that they've painted their blogs black. So it was quite interesting because we had a huge discussion in the art field, and how within this, like how engage art can be really stupid. And this was the example that was really stupid. The good thing was that after they painted like these black squares, more people get to know about this neighborhood, and it started to be like more visible for the public opinion. So the public opinion, leftist artist and liberal opinion thought that there's something wrong, we shouldn't have things like this. So finally in 2007 they managed to move all families to a normal households within the city. And so the name it was Przeworska of this neighborhood. We had a huge program of revitalization where part of it was connecting 5,000 housing units to the city heating system, which was quite important because often people had really low rent, but they were paying immense amounts of money for heating, because the buildings were old and they use either electricity or gas, or they were stealing electricity, or they were doing different things, and it was extremely dangerous. We are having the city renewal viewed from the people's perspective. Here you see the photos of the project I was doing with my foundation before I started working in the municipality, and it was called Faces of Revitalizations, or the People of Revitalization. And we are trying to tell the story about the local environment and the revitalization process, asking people about their opinion. Like the guy here on the left, top left, it's an activist. The woman here, she is a tenant who was successful in restructurization of her, like the money that she didn't pay. This is another woman who is activist. These girls are like the very engaged tenants working, living in the communal housing. This is like old lady from the communal housing, which was quite nice because what we were fighting for, it was to show the human face of the revitalization, that it's not only modernization of building and creating this paradigm of supporting local communities. And we had really interesting discussion because like probably many people here, I have like the leftist background, and we have the tendency to idealize social problems. Often people ask, "Oh, what will happen if with these guys who are now drinking beer on benches?" And no one asks the question, where are the children and families? And during this process on revitalization, it turned out that when these guys are out, their families are inside the house or they're hidden. And this project was really interesting. It was called Backyard Guard. The sausage dog was the guard. And the sausage dog was the personification of the presence of the kids. So the kids were reclaiming the public space, which was usually used by the people who were like drinking alcohol for their needs. And it was quite interesting because when you use this animal, somehow it was visible for them that the place is for them, and these drunken guys, they disappeared somehow. And often it is like this, that when you are talking about like the excluded groups, you really have to look carefully and see that in this like the family with problems, often the problem is like alcohol and the people and the oppressive relations that keep women and kids and elderly outside from the structure. We are using as well like this kind of participatory approach. This is a photo from workshop on multi-generation and tenant house. Stalowa 29 is the address of the building, and the idea was to create a building on the idea of social mix. It was first thought to be a kind of elderly house, then we thought that it would be better to mix them with some other people. And finally, you have 12 flats and a place upstairs on the top roof for the young adults who who try to get independent. So we are thinking in this way that creating good city is trying to mixing different generations. And when we are starting the program, we set ourselves like 6 main challenges. First was like attracting talents, which means young people from other cities, or keeping people in Warsaw from going, for example, to Berlin, because we are migrating to Berlin as well as you. Another thing was social integrity, so creating the program and mixture when you have different social groups in one building, and not like in one place you have put the people on the social rent, in other on the commercial rent, one building for the elderly and another for youth with problems. No, you are mixing them to try to create sustainable community. Third is migration, and in Poland we have really impressive government, and we don't like very much migrants. It's mostly the migration within the country, which means that in Warsaw we need more and more affordable flats for the people who came there and they are not earning a lot. Another thing was aging, that we know that Warsaw, like if you take the numbers, like the average age of the inhabitants of Warsaw is not changing, but we know that we live longer, and it's not changing because people are living longer and you have a lot of young families that are coming to the city, which means that we have huge number of seniors, but still we have more people, so average the same. Another thing was like sustainable development, so trying to think about sustainable transport, sustainable planning, and as well the different sources of energy. And the last one is quality of resource, and it's mostly means modernizing the flats that we have. And we had like one operational goal, which was called affordable housing. And we wrote affordable housing, and what does it mean? And we are looking for a number and the indicator to measure the affordability, and we found one in papers of UN Habitat, when they write that affordable house is the house that doesn't cost more than 30% of money that the household owns. So it's the money that you earn or some other subsidies that you often had. We made a huge report to show what is the structure and the financial structure in Warsaw, because we have really low unemployment rate. It's like about 3% or even less. And people are earning quite well. And out of sudden we realized that we need more flats for people who have jobs, because most of the people in Warsaw have jobs. And that's why we thought that we have to, instead of thinking about commercial market and communal housing, we have to think in a different way. We have to create 4 segments that will fill the gap. And A was like the social housing for socially disadvantaged, and it was like social rent, but as well assisted housing or shelter and training housing. This is an example of one of the training flats, which is quite huge. Second was the community housing units for low-income households. And my favorite one is in Praga district on Jagiellońska Street, and this it's winning like many prizes because it's quite nice. They have like the library on the basement, like shop, and they have this I don't know what is the name in English, but they have like it's not like the children's house, but they had like the when you have 12 kids without families and they are living in a flat. It's the part of the assisted housing, but it's for kids. You have this 2 flats like this and this, and you cannot see which one is it, which is quite nice because these kids simply go home and no one knows that it's a different home than the others. We have as well this TBAs, this non-profit housing. It's for the middle income groups. And one of the examples looks quite luxurious, and one of the smaller investments. So again, you cannot make the difference between development housing and this like municipal non-profit housing, which is something normal in other European countries, Western European countries, but not necessarily in our region. And this is another segment. It's like segment D, and we call it commercial rent, but it's the rent when you don't have this surplus of developer income. So it's almost no profit. But not subsidized. Like the segment C is subsidized. For example, city gives land or some money. So this segment is not subsidized. And this is the segment that I'm working currently. It's Housing Plus. So it's based on the fund, the governmental fund, but you have to give back the money. So it's commercial, and somehow it's commercial. It's like in European countries you have like these commercial funds that are building for rent. So here we have got like the governmental money which is invested to build housing for rent, which is in cities Warsaw we were counting that the rent will be approximately about €6 per or 7 euros, 7 or 8 euros now per square meter, which is still much less than the market rental average. We are thinking about implementing as well housing innovations, like community rental agencies or social rental agencies, because it's translated in a different way. And this is the idea that an NGO has his tenants, and it's renting apartment from the city or from private owners, and this NGO who is paying, and the tenants are paying to the NGO, or it's founded in a different way. And this is the model which is created for groups that are regarded as risky. Mothers with big families, or fathers, rather planned mothers, migrants, and many other people whom a private owner would never rent a flat because would not like to have problems. And when the site and when it's rented to the NGO, which is the operator, is safer. So this is one of the ideas to deal with the kind of rental risk. This multi-generation housing is what I was mentioning before, and housing cooperatives that we still don't know what to do with the idea. The idea was to find few parts of the land, but at the moment all the municipal land goes for the housing program, the municipal housing program. And we had a huge discussion about the cooperatives, because most of the cooperatives that we understand as group of people who come together and want to build housing, not to buy from a developer, are hipsters or creative middle class, or people who are friends of my friends or friends of the deputy mayor. And there was a question, why help them when you are not helping first the people who don't have income? And we were trying to push this discussion in a way not to create cooperatives like co-ownership, but to create co-housing projects on the rental model, when the added value for the neighborhood is that usually this kind of people have one other feature: they are extremely pro-social. So they are activists, so they want to make the environment better. You can ask them to help the other tenants, and they simply care more. And at the moment we were thinking to create like one of projects like this, but there's still no final decision about the land. So we are mostly going like this, like co-housing rental model. So the theoretical model is ready, but there is no final decision. And then the idea was to create this, to have this 1,100 housing units by 2030. And the part of the policy was as well an attempt to affect in a way the private market by using urban planning tool, some direction towards transportation and mobility, renewing degraded areas, showing which areas are the better investment areas, so the places when you have like the transport, we are developing our underground. We only have 2 lines, and we are now building more the second line. And one of the areas which will be developed quite soon, it's Chrzanów. It's on the border of Warsaw, but you have like underground there, which means it's quite easy to get to the city center. We are planning as well to create a model district. We call it like Warsaw Community District or Warsaw Social District. It's 15 hectares, so it's about between 2,000 up to 3,000 flats. And the idea was to do it on this, like you see this ABCD, to do it on the perfect mix. And as well to do as well some maybe some workplaces and things like this, parking in the middle, school, and to think more in a complex way, because before it didn't have it anymore. And what was quite funny, even on the market, when you were looking on this like advisory agencies, something really important happened like I think 2 months ago. We have the merging of 2 big companies. First was the advisory company that is called REAS, and second was the international JLL, which is mostly into commercial markets, offices, and so they merged, which is quite good, because now we have this knowledge of housing and like commercial rental for offices in one place. So it's easier to think about this like sustainable district when you have houses and offices like next to each other, and not in a way that in one place you have CBD with all the offices, and somewhere else you have like houses and people have to move to every day like between them, wasting a lot of time, being stuck in the traffic jams and things like this. And what was quite important as well, we wanted to get people into the discussion, and we are working in a participatory process. In the first part we have like 8 discussions, then we have even more on different topics, and the idea how we worked is like inviting experts, asking them for text, 5 pages or more, and then what was following workshops. So first we're having discussion, we are having like the first I was saying points to the discussion, and then we are asking people who want to share their knowledge to participate in the 2-day or 3-day workshop to get the most of the knowledge that you have within the city and within the social activists. Sometimes we are paying, sometimes we are not paying, and depending on the level of the expertise and the engagement of the people. Yeah, and this is one thing. And another thing I want to show you. It's what has changed on the level of national programs, because although, as I told you, that government didn't really care about the housing policy as such, as a complex approach, it didn't mean that we don't have any money on housing programs. We had 2 huge housing programs starting from 2007. One was called Rodzina na swoim, so family on their own. And second one that followed, it was called Housing for Young, Mieszkanie dla młodych. And the idea was to stimulate the private commercial market and ownership. Both of these programs were subsidies. The first one was the subsidies for mortgages. And you can imagine what happened. Mortgages became more expensive. So when government was paying more. And the second one, the housing. And in the first program, you can either build in new buildings or in the existing one, so from the individual owners. The second program, Mieszkanie dla młodych, was even worse because the idea was that you can buy houses in new developments, and there was a certain price limit. which means that people were forced to participate in the program, were forced to buy flats in the outskirts of the city that the developers couldn't sell on the normal market. And in 2015 we have this like speculation bubble. Then it turned out that most of the mortgages in the Swiss francs are extremely dangerous for the people, and people were not eager anymore. So our former government decided to create another program. It was called the Housing Rental Fund. And the idea was to, again, buy from the developers already existing buildings and rent it. First, the idea was to rent it cheaper, and at the moment it's not cheaper at all. So we had a lot of public money which was put to keep the high rental prices. Completely ridiculous. And the company I work in, it's called like PFR Real Estate, and before BGK Real Estate, was created to be operator of the first fund. Luckily, in 2016, they created another program which is called like Housing Plus, which is our like main domain. This is the part that I work at, and the idea was to create this affordable housing using private funds, and it is a kind of complex financial mechanism, but we had, although we are a governmental program, we had to operate on a commercial level. This is the result of some European regulation, that we are not intervening in the market. That's why, and so the government couldn't give us the money to make the housing cheaper, as you usually do, as you are a municipality, to create communal housing. So you simply add 2/3, 3/3, 1/3, depending how cheap you want to rent it. So they created another tool, which is called Flat for the Start, Rental Subsidy Fund. And idea was to give individual people some surplus money to diminish their rent. So this first program was for the housing company, our housing company, and this one was for our future tenants. And what was quite interesting, because we have this huge tension between local level, when you have like this liberal parties, and the national level when you have our like rightist parties and far right parties. Somehow it was a kind of tricky way. Someone thought about this Mieszkanie na Start idea, so this rental subsidy fund, that it only works when it's cooperation between local government and national program, which was quite good, because to rent it well, so our company to rent it well and to be sure that the people will have money to pay the rent, we have to cooperate with the local government. So this was the trick, and this was this kind of innovation. What is at the moment the biggest challenge? It's we are trying to find with the rising cost of building houses, and we are going into like prefabrication and things like this. We had a huge contest to create like the modern prefabrication building, because we want to have our set of like Lego blocks, or like Lego Techniques blocks, to put it together and create from this like different types of houses, which will be like comfortable and affordable. Another big changes that is in the housing policy is the quality of buildings. When you are a private developer and you are building a house, and you are selling it straight ahead. Usually you are selling the flats before the building is built, because the queue is so huge. Then people move in, and after 3 years they have their like community, and the developer is out. Which means you are building buildings in a way that they look nice in the first 3 up to 4 or 5 years. Here, when you have a rental program, and the fund is investing, you have to build in a way that the buildings are not losing the quality over the time. And this is the biggest difference. It's probably no one is often talking about this, but this is the biggest revolution. Because I remember, like 3 years ago, I invited a girl who was working on in Switzerland, and I was asking her, how come buildings in Switzerland look so stable, they're so well maintained, and so on? She said it's the question of financing, simply. In Switzerland, like in many countries, the funds are investing, so they cannot allow themselves for the building to collapse or to look ugly after 10 years. And this is quite interesting because it's ridiculous. It's changing perspective, and the change is visible as well on the private market, because we have more and more private funds as well, which are investing in rental. It's on first, like when we were starting this program, we were having only like this top class, premium, elite, extremely expensive. It was so expensive that I don't even remember. But it was like for the people who are like the expats or directors of the international companies, and we had like 50 of flats like this. And now you have this like rental offer, the developer from the private developers, which is dedicated towards like working middle class.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Before proceeding to the questions, I would just like to ask. So the Housing Plus program that you emphasize as a novelty in comparison to the previous policy approach, that's also 5 billion zloty, right? It's not 5
Yeah, plus. As far probably it will be about 16 or something like this.
Billion.
Yeah, billion.
Yeah. Okay, okay. Because it just it seems to be a small sum.
Yeah, because we had for the first round for more about like this 25,000 houses. We have this 5. That's why I've added plus, because we are they're adding money.
No,
like
but what I'm asking is that it's 5 billion and not 5 million, right?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, billion.
So that was just wanted to clarify. Yeah, as zloty is more than 70 Hungarian forints. For those of you who are not familiar with the currency rate, so you can do some math about at least the magnitude of these expenses. And we have around half an hour left, which is quite short, unfortunately. So I will try to ask brief questions, and I would also ask you to respond as briefly as you can. And my first question would be not so much about policy. We would dedicate the rest of the discussion to the more strictly speaking policy issues. But first I would like to ask about what you think is your contribution to all of this in terms of, because you already mentioned that in 2014 or 15, housing was not on the agenda of politicians and even for like urban policy strategies in Warsaw, and then in a few years this changed. And as the focus of this conference is really how to get into politics and how to get into decision-making positions and within or inside institutions. But most of the scenarios we are discussing are collective strategies, right? So that we have a movement and we decide to run in the election, and we gain power essentially in the local council or maybe even above. And whereas your involvement in politics is more of a personal strategy, I suppose, like a personal like scale jumping, so to speak. And so what do you think, like what would have changed if it isn't you who are coordinating, for example, the compilation of the Warsaw 2030 strategy, but someone from the, city council, just who would otherwise do such things, like have done so?
Probably if they haven't employed me, there would be no housing policy. They would stick to the programs, because we have a housing program, but the housing is limited only for the communal flats and a bit this TBS part. So and because I didn't have any other, this was my only job. So it was my only task in the housing company, because first I was working in this non-profit company, and from that position coordinating this housing program, and then in the housing office. Probably you wouldn't have it. You wouldn't have it in this this form that we have it. So when you have, because the housing policy is about spatial planning, that you have to be you have to be built close to the public transport, because if you force people to have cars, it means that they have additional money to pay on everyday basis. Then we were trying to put together all the segments, and probably it will be a different document. But but about like my personal involvement, like before I was working on this like housing policy, I was like an activist working on the strategy of Warsaw. And probably one of my biggest challenges was forcing the group that was working on strategy to put housing as a separate goal. I know that it sounds ridiculous, but it's often like this. All of the innovation that we have are due to the personal involvement and persistence on one person. Like we have like a city bike because one guy in one office was so persistent, so he didn't give up, although it was extremely difficult. And then he had time, and he mobilized others to put it forward. It completely shouldn't be working like this.
Yeah.
But it is working like this.
So maybe the lesson to be learned in terms of strategies for social change is that once social movements and maybe committed researchers and so on like develop the fertile ground for such reforms to take place, then even individual involvements in decision-making positions can make a difference. Like, would that be a fair sum?
Yeah, I can say that I created my job, like putting like housing policy as a separate goal, and then creating like the network of people and getting in contact with the people who are working within the city council was something that enabled me to come in and coordinate the whole housing program and the housing policy. But this was possible only because there was a kind of social environment and then huge social pressure on the side of the tenant movements that this is a politically hot topic, I would say.
Okay. Then starting with the policy questions, so it seems to be quite straightforward that both in Warsaw and in Budapest, most experts would agree that you would need to increase the number of, let's say, affordable rental. Now disregarding the details, whether it should be council housing or housing units operated by these non-profit housing corporations and so on. But this is one issue, and then a separate issue is whether the city itself should build, or maybe it is perhaps better if it rents out vacant housing units in private ownership. And so what I would like to ask is that why do you think it was important to decide on building as one part of broadening the council housing or social housing sector in Warsaw? Like, why to build?
Not only to build, and the program is not about building, but it's about having access. So the segment D, so the part of the affordable housing, can be built by the state company or by any other investor who is willing to build cheaply and affordably and get rid of the from the private rent. Like even my company, which is like responsible for the housing program, we we have few investments that we bought from the private developers that they agreed that they will not get the money straight ahead, but they will be getting it like in the next 30 years. So it's not about the thing that the municipal companies have to build all this like 15,000. The idea was to have access to the houses. Another question is whether it's easier to rent it on the market, because at the moment in the Warsaw market, every flat is sold on the private market before it's built. People are buying holes in the ground. And prices are getting higher and higher. So owning companies or working with the municipal or state companies was the way how you control the costs, and you control like the added value. Mm-hmm. What was quite interesting that when we had this discussion on the program and when we had the election, for a kind of middle class, it was not very obvious that you have to build affordable houses. Because you have so many people who should be able to rent flat, but they were forced to take mortgages, that they are really unhappy that the first two programs were for buying, not for rental. So we have a huge social tensions. That what we are doing now, that we are building affordable rental housing, is unjust. It's socially unjust because so many people were forced to buy their private ownership. This is an interesting tension. And when people were talking about like this program on this, like the people from this liberal politics, like the electorate wasn't very happy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and in terms of the private rental sector, my understanding is that the strategy aims to create and expand like a semi-private segment of that sector, which would
with some regulation,
yes,
rental regulation,
like a regulated segment of that sector. But my question is like, what is it that the city can do in terms of the strictly speaking private rental market, which I understand to be problematic on many levels, both in terms of the level of rents, the affordability of the rents, but also in terms of the informality of that sector and the corresponding insecurity of housing of those renting those units. So what is it that Warsaw can do or is considering doing in terms of regulating or
frankly speaking,
changing?
not much. Of course, we have the planning tools. So you can make it as difficult as possible to build in the places when there is no social infrastructure and no infrastructure. We had one law that enables to charge the developer when city has to build a road, but there is no way to charge a developer if the city has to build a school. We have as well soft tools. Part of my work was to creating something we call a Warsaw housing standard. It was the set of rules or a set of information what the good housing looks like. That it has to be close to the social infrastructure, like schools, nursery houses. It has to be close to the public transport. It has to be sustainable in a way how you cooperate with the nature. It has to have social mix, and we had a round of talks with the private sectors, with an association of developers, which wants to build good houses and wants to get better opinion than the bad developers, because we have the investors that are playing fair. They are doing like innovative projects, and probably because they have earned some money before on a more nasty project. And as well, we have investors that they are building cheap, selling expensive, and not caring about the social infrastructure. So what we could only promise that we'll create set of rules, and if someone is someone's project is meeting all these expectations, the investment process will be faster. We cannot say it as a law because it's illegal, but investment process takes quite long because you have to check everything. So if you have the checklist and you are only checking whether this is the same as the expectation, then the investment process could go faster, and money is time. And this was the approach that the soft approach will be when we will be doing. Probably one of the most interesting topics that we are currently discussing is the question of mobility. And like in my job for this like private for this public program, we had a huge investment for 3,000 flats in Warsaw, and the parking rate is half car per flat, which is quite low, and it's near the railway station, but it's not very central. But when we were talking, the city council agreed for this low parking rate when the company agreed to give a place for a school in the middle of the investment. And this was something new. And at the moment, I'm responsible as well for creating framework for the mobility package, including car sharing or other types of shared mobility like scooters and other stuff, or answering as well the question what kind of shops and other things should be next to houses for the people to leave their private cars. And this is the thing that the private market is interested as well, because parking lots, building a parking lot is extremely expensive. So creating this sustainable development and promoting sustainable mobility, it's in financial interest of the investors. So we don't have any hard rules, but we can we can find like a common solution that are kind of soft solutions.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And before turning to the audience for questions, my last question would be about evictions. And to sum this legislation, perhaps not very inaccurately, at least, up, is that if you are a tenant, either in the private sector or in a council housing, and if you are about to get evicted, then the court tests whether you would be eligible for social housing, and if you are, then you cannot get evicted before you are provided with
by municipality.
By the municipality this housing, and if the eviction process for this reason is suspended, then the person who, or the company who rents out your flat can sue the local authority for reparations for their harm, which in a way creates a quite important financial incentive for the local authority to do their job in terms of allocating housing to those who would otherwise become homeless, which sounds quite nice. But my question would be, how does
it works?
Two questions maybe. How does it work on the ground? And then second, how come that you have this law? This is quite nice. Like why? Like what was the brief political background for this legislation?
It's quite, as far as speaking, it's quite an old law, because it has like a few years, and we have like quite I would say like active tenant movements, and we have as well once we had a leftist government as well, many years before. But as we were talking before, what has recently changed, that when in 2015 housing became an issue, and then in 2016 it became even a bigger issue when you had like this national housing program. We had a lot of evictions then, and there was a kind of common sense, shared common sense by people in Poland, by that private ownership, it's something that it's more important than have a right to a flat, housing right. That people owe their flats, and if someone is not paying, he or she has to be evicted, simply, have to deal somehow. And at that time, like the local municipalities weren't very empathic, but somehow the political cost of every eviction started to be so huge that the city started to find a solution, and first they stopped evicting from their flats, and then they were finding faster flats for the people who were evicted from different flats. What has changed recently? Because our tenant law got liberalized, or we had now two new types of agreement. One is called occasional rent, and this is an agreement that, for example, me as an owner have with my tenant, and the tenant gives an address where he or she will move when stopped paying the rent and is evicted. So then it's not the role of the municipality, but is the role of the tenant simply to leave the flat. Second law that was put forward in 2017, I think, it's quite recent, was the law created for this like Housing Plus program, and it's called like institutional rent. When the tenant agrees that if he or she is not paying, she can be evicted. And this regulation is not working that you are talking. And we had a huge discussion because it whether like the social advantage of building 100,000 houses or for the first round less, it's worth creating an agreement which is anti-tenant. Because if we didn't have this law, no fund would invest money, which means that you wouldn't have this new segment. And this was really a hard discussion. There are not many people who already moved into like this Housing Plus program. There are probably like 300 families because we are still building. No one was evicted yet. First of all, the political cost is quite huge. So this is like the political culture, really not the law that is keeping the tenants inside. And second is that if you're a private investor, it's eviction is expensive. First is like the political cost or other costs of something getting person, and then you have to refurbish the flat and find new tenant, which usually costs more than the money that people owe you. What we have as well in our agreements in this like Housing Plus program, that you have to pay straight ahead 6 months rent. And we have a kind of insurance, and at the moment we, like many municipalities and as well companies, are working on programs that will prevent people getting into like financial problems with paying. So contacting them, giving like psychological help, because like many situation is something that's tragic happens. Sometimes someone gets ill, someone doesn't have a job. The good thing, which is that we have a really low unemployment rate. So like the situation when the people are really in problem is quite rare, because our economy is doing quite well. What will happen in the next few years, no one knows.
Okay, thank you very much. And since we are running out of time, maybe we should collect all the questions from the audience, and then maybe because there might be some overlaps, and it would be easier that way to answer them. So I see 3 hands. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should keep the order, because all questions would be heard at once. We seem to have an issue with that microphone. No, for the translation you would need to speak in the mic. But if I may invite you here, then we could proceed. Because I don't think this has a long enough. Just sit, take a seat.
It's okay here. Okay. So as I understand, there is a problem, the way that many people who would not like to get involved in a mortgage are forced to. So that there is indeed a higher percentage of owners, occupier owners, than renters. So do you have, maybe you said it, but maybe I missed, is there an exact number, what percentage of the Warsaw society owns its flats and or is paying still its mortgage, and which percentages in general, in all different categories, is renting? Do you have a number of that?
Thank you.
I have more questions.
Oh, you have?
This was just
Oh, okay, then please go ahead. No, I would like her to respond to all the questions at once because we
okay, then I will just go on. So it means there is a possible problem of what I might call a poverty ownership. That means a class of people who are not necessarily wouldn't be owners, but they are first. So it's so an ownership in poverty, and that may have, I think, long run results. The second question goes with the Swiss franc issue. How was that created? Is it more a pragmatical thing, not to be attached to euro, but of political reasons that maybe they had chosen francs? I don't know. But is there also other kind of links to Switzerland? Because in Switzerland there's a new movement of cooperatives. So they have this old, let's say, from 1920s, 30s, this old group generation of cooperatives, but they also have now this new generation of cooperatives which have kind of new types of social mixes and agendas, and also responsibilities towards the neighborhood and the community. So there's this K2 and so on. They started in the last 20 years, this new cooperative movement in Switzerland. And you also have been naming these innovations in the housing sector in Warsaw. So has that been, in that sense, the cooperative, and you also listed there also the cooperatives, has that been also kind of somewhat inspired by the Swiss new cooperative issue? Okay, that was it.
Thank you.
Okay, I couldn't follow all the numbers on the financing. Nor do I have any idea about the budget of Warsaw or Poland. But I had the impression that suddenly you put much more money, the public put much more money into housing than before. So if you can give, like, what was the political reason behind it? Or how could that happen? I mean, do I get it right that it is much more? And who is financing? Is it the city of Warsaw, or is it government money or EU money? So what's the magnitude of the change, and what's the politics behind it?
Thanks.
Yes, I have just one short question, and which is about the fact that what you showed us seems to be an immense work of social planning, and it looked very much top-down as well. And I would be interesting how you managed to kind of put together the market sentiment, that there are a lot of people who want to live in a flat which they themselves have some saying how it looks like, and also why do you have this A, B, C, D that also looks like very restrictive as well, and this looks like very, I mean, you basically just define certain categories, and this is from our point of view, this looks like a huge social planning exercise, and I would be really interested in the process, and how can you sell it, and how can you make people happy with such very precise regulation.
Thanks. Okay. So that's a lot of questions. We might not have the time for you to respond to all of them. My suggestion would be to leave out the questions with the foreign currency loans, foreign currency mortgages, because that is the topic that most of the audience would be most familiar with, because they're Hungarians, and that was like the only housing issue that was really spoken about in the past 5 years or 10 years. And that could be a part of a more small group discussion maybe, and then I would like to ask you to respond to the rest of the questions in more detail if that's
So
fine.
first Swiss francs, yeah? Or
No, that is what I thought you shouldn't answer, because
maybe I'll just ask you how I write them, because some of them it's like going deep. Swiss franc was simply cheaper, and it seemed rational that time. And we have advisors that were advising people that it's cheaper and rational. About private ownership, 19% of the houses is like flats as private ownership. How many of them are rented? We don't know. We don't have numbers because people often don't register when they are renting a flat, which is like dangerous for both sides. But somehow they like to take the risk. Poverty ownership, there was a kind of a problem, but it wasn't a political problem because if people couldn't keep the flat that they bought out in center of the city, they were simply selling it and buying cheaper elsewhere. And many cities in Poland were forcing people to buy flats that they couldn't then afford and don't caring at all what will happen with them next. We don't have any Swiss links, so more we look into Berlin. Of course, if we are academics, we look in all the cities, all in Europe. Our cooperative movement is not very strong. There are a group of people who are kind of interested, but they are, although there were few attempts, they didn't create any movement or any group that will effectively force either government or city council to do something with it. At the moment on the legislative level, national level, we are working on creating the definition of the cooperative for the groups to be able to gather funding from banks. Because from banks they are extremely risky because they don't know what is the kind of group and what is the idea. And if you want to build three cooperatives, it's even more risky because you have more of the people. Going to this like social engineering and this like top-down approach. Every politics is social engineering. Even if the politics that says, oh, do everything you want, do what you want, it's market to decide, then you're simply forcing. We are trying to put a paradigm which is it's rather flexible because no one is forced to live in a kind of segment. But we had one research that was quite interesting for us because in our housing program, this Housing Plus, we tried to answer the question, what should be the standard of the flats that we give? Either it should be something, it's called like, we call it like developer standard, which means that you as a former tenant or a future owner do everything what you want. You choose your tiles, you choose everything, colors of your walls and everything. Or it should be like more with this like fit out approach that you simply move in and the only thing you buy it's bad, but you have tiles and everything. So we made a research and it turned out that people prefer to have a finished flat than choose their tiles. Because finishing the apartment is extremely expensive. And if you are renting it, it's cheaper because it's a kind of mass product. And for my CEOs, it was a big surprise because everyone thought that people are, especially in Poland, they're more attached to their private choice because and things like this. According to the question, what has changed? It's true that out of sudden the housing policy became an important issue. And I think that there are two reasons. First is this Swiss franc speculation bubble, when it turned out that you have to have something for rental. And second is the huge cruelty around this like reprivatization topic, restitution topic, when the housing as such became a huge and hot topic, and I think as well like it is a result like of many years of discussion and the lobbying of the different tenant organization or urban movement and showing that it's finally a topic that became important. Probably housing was one of the last topics that was not touched at all. The mobility, there's something happened in mobility, something happened in urban planning, and it's only housing left. It's only question why so late? because it's really, really late. It's 25 years after our transition. And I think it's all questions.
Well, then thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for you as well for listening. I hope it was either useful or inspiring, or maybe both.